running great on every device. In UE4, we have a couple of different systems for this. So we have scalability groups, and these are intended for settings that can change at runtime. So for instance, here you can see some of the foliage quality settings at different levels, in this case on iOS. So at low settings, there's no foliage at all. At medium setting, here, when you're running on an iPhone 10, we first apply all of the settings in the iPhone 10 device profile drastically. I mentioned audio, so in terms of variation, our sound design team added a number of variations for things like gunshots or when you're hitting a wooden wall or a concrete wall. And so we added the ability to say, we want to limit the number of variations on downsample sounds based on the platform. We can change the compression quality settings. And we can also change the threshold for real-time decompression. This is a memory and performance trade-off.
Two sections. Fortnite's a game that's been in development for a while, and when we switched, the characters have 4 LODs and 3 for weapons. We have a bake pose for LODs without facial bones. Here in LOD 1, you can see that there's a pose actually baked into the character, kind of giving you an idea of how that works. In Fortnite, we decided that LOD 1 will remove facial bones. LOD 2 will remove finger and twist bones. And the nice thing about this asset is you plug it into all of your skeletal meshes, and you're able to make broad, sweeping changes to the entire project just by tweaking one LOD asset. We switched our character materials from being masked to opaque. To add variation in skins, artists were painting, they were masking out various parts of the character, like pouches or straps, when they didn't want to have them displayed on the character. And this gives overdraw. The overdraw of that material has a performance on mobile, and if so, let's turn on the directional light and swap out the skylight for something that works better for that platform. For effects, we started using explicit detail modes. In the past, our detail modes were inclusive. That means that anything in low detail mode, medium detail, would also appear in high detail mode. We wanted to be more targeted with the optimizations that we were making, and that's why we switched to explicit detail modes. This means that we can have an emitter that only shows up in low quality on mobile and doesn't affect any other platform. We also had to remove morph target meshes from effects. This is because those morph target meshes cannot be LOD'd, and the textures that define the morph were non-streaming uncompressed textures. Both of these are attributes that did not play nicely with our goal of trying to reduce memory across the platform. We also implemented significance settings for effects. I believe James talked about our significance manager earlier. What this allows the game to do is say, when there's a lot of combat going on and the performance is starting to lower, we can turn off effects that have low significance. We also enabled fixed bounds for as many particles that it made sense to do so for. This allows the game to call those particle systems more accurately. For effects materials, we switched to per vertex or non-directional lighting. Previously, we had been using per pixel lighting for our effects materials, but we were able to make the switch without much of a quality loss. We also consolidated our effects materials and utilized switches. Previously, there had been a few materials that looked similar or were doing similar effects, but the more materials you have, the more shader permutations you have, which is more memory. So we were able to consolidate these and implement a few switches that let us change those materials. We also disabled environmental effects on the mobile platform. One of the optimizations we had to take a look at was we had a few actors in the world that had a lot of components to them. An example here is the weapons that are dropped in the world. In the beginning, they had a few components. One was the weapon model. It had a translucent sheet behind that model, and also had a particle system adding some glowing rays. And lastly, it had a duplicate of that weapon model to do an outline effect on the weapon so it stood out in the world. So we combined the particle effect into the translucent shader using vertex shaders and just some shader math. And then we removed. This means that these textures will essentially eat up a block of memory and will never MIP down. So you have to assume that you're always going to have to deal with that chunk of memory. We try to make that list of textures as small as possible and things that absolutely have to be set to never stream. We also gave some UI textures MIP maps so that they could scale down on different platforms. And then we moved on to generic texture optimizations. reducing the size of textures, and then can assume that anything on high quality just looks better. As you can see in this example, we actually cannot get away with culling a lot of objects, which Ryan will talk about later. So we reworked the cull distances for all of our objects across the project. We were culling objects aggressively that are smaller than a player. We also set decorative objects to be disabled on mobile using detail mode. In this image, you can see some of the posters and a light that's being disabled using detail mode. And we're also not able to cut a lot of objects using this categorization, but usually it's things like posters, trash on the ground, things that are very thin in the world. And then in Fortnite, all objects are placed as blueprints. So we're able to tweak these values on a per asset basis rather than having to dig into the level and tweak every single placed object. For environment model optimization, our models have about 3 to 4 LODs, depending upon how complex that model is. Sometimes the min LOD for mobile is set to 1, sometimes it's set to 2 for objects like vehicles that are very high poly in LOD 0. We had to be extremely aggressive with our environment LODs. Here you can see for objects that are super granular, like bales of hay or things that are just repeating a lot in the world, we had to have LODs that were in the range of 20 triangles. We also had to combine meshes together. Here you can see the ground, which is not destructible, and normally it's made of a lot of different tiles, and we decided to start grouping those meshes together and rendering them as one object. We had to balance this against memory usage. Was to do an optimization pass on our grass. We added LODs to the meshes being used, and then we optimized the vertex shader. The vertex shader had a couple features. In Fortnite, players can place their own walls. We call these player-built walls. These are implemented as the storm clouds in Fortnite are built using tessellated planes in the sky, the storm. Thanks. I'm going to hand it off to Ryan to continue talking about content optimizations.
Tilted Towers originally had almost 2,000 draw calls just from the 15 buildings alone, and that was without shadows being enabled. And the way that we enabled destructible HLOD, which I'll just call DHLOD for short in the slides, is by exposing a new setup asset for the LOD system for each map. This is called a little bit similar to the character hiding system Jordan mentioned before, where we use vertex colors on the combined mesh to identify each piece with a unique index. So since buildings have more than 256 parts, which is all you can get out of a single 8-bit vertex color, we quantize this to be a 2D. This is showing the comparison for that building from, on the left, the original mesh, around 70,000 triangles from the previous low LODs, and then the destructible HLOD in the middle, and then the far proxy again on the right. So an important thing, I'll iterate again. I'm going to show it one more time. Going back to before. So the area to look to if you want to actually spot differences is around window frames. We lose some detail there because we would have actually had to add polygons to capture that detail due to the way that Fortnite is textured. And we might try to improve that in the future. So we took this one step further and then also built the option to combine imposters into the hierarchical LOD system. So you can see here that when we're far back in selecting that swamp area, one of the POIs, or points of interest in the game, the Lonely Lodge, or some people call it the Ranger Station, have a blobby mess, and then with the imposters, it looks much more defined, and you can tell what the trees are meant to look like. This saved around 180,000 triangles from the always loaded memory, and around 270,000 verts, which is what we actually tend to talk about when we discuss optimization, since verts is what your things like vertex shaders actually operate on, and what defines the memory cost more than triangles. And the GIF there is just showing what the transition is like as you go into the forest. The biggest thing to notice is you'll start to see the wind animation when it switches to a real tree, but that should be the most noticeable. A comparison of what the landscape looks like on high-end PC and console right now, 2 different views. And this is what it looks like on the low PC version and mobile permutation. This is kind of an update to an old school method where we would use blob shadows underneath objects. You know, everyone knows that from Mario. You have a nice little soft blob shadow underneath you, and that's what grounds the character. And without some sort of grounding shadow, trees kind of look like they're floating, so it helps the quality. This version was made by taking captures of each tree from 4 different angles and then converting each of those to a distance. That's actually applied is that the vertex shader, or I should also say that each tree has a single little quad, which is 2 triangles underneath it.
Mostly And so to sort of give a bit of context to that, we'll talk about the goals of what that we made. We started with what we call the weapon pose layer, and this is going to be basically the prop or the weapon that we're carrying. And then the second big part, step number 2, will be the locomotion. So this is where we're going to be walking, running, jumping, doing all different things. It looks small, but it's actually in a state machine on there. And you can see it's not very complex. We have the idle, we have a part for the jump, a part for the fall here. We land, and then this is all the movement in there. So walk, run, all these. So that was step number 2. And step number 3, we have another locomotion state machine here, and that's the additive. So we'll explain why we need that. And then the final part is the IK. So we do a bit of post-processing at the end before we just output it in the game. So our goal being trying to decouple as many things as we can and then sort of piece them together at runtime and share them. The best case scenario that we could have is we can describe a weapon by a unique pose. Mm-hmm. That would be ideal. So we try to reach that goal. So we pulled out the locomotion apart from weapon poses. And so we'll show an example here where we have our guy, and that's the pose that he has when he's carrying a sledgehammer.
So just real quick, for people that are putting together, motion sets, a lot of what we try.
When we're looking at this guy here, he's carrying the sledgehammer. So I'm going to go and disable all the other layers. So we have the other layers. They're all turned off. So what we see is really just the weapon pose for that sledgehammer. We can switch between different poses. So the pistol would look like this, shotgun would look like this, and so on. So going back to our melee, now we want to have this guy move. So we'll go into the second part. So I'm going to increase the speed a little bit here. So he should be moving, but he's not because we disabled that. So now we're going to enable the locomotion layer. So as soon as we enable that guy, he's going to be moving. So that's really just a straight blend between the upper body, the weapon pose that is completely static. It's one frame. And then we have the locomotion layer. And that locomotion layer can go from idle, and then we have a jog and a run. We have different speeds for that. And different directions, and we have the jump and all the locomotion. So very static. So that's the main problem that we have with the upper body, because it's only one pose. When the player decides to jump or turn or those kind of things, it's very rigid. So we add the layer number 3, which is the locomotion additive. So we add now all the sway and the motion in the upper body. So the reason that we pulled that out is because we found that that secondary motion that's additive is something that we can share between a lot of different weapons. So we can make different postures, different weapon poses very cheaply just by using one pose, and then we can reuse some secondary motion that we've done.
So like as far as the animation content, when we're creating it, like the one that you're seeing right now with the melee, all of that animation is actually done in Maya, and we do the entire animation set, the entire traversal set with like a 4-way run. And if we need to, like for something like a narrow grip, we could actually do a pose that would just push the hands closer together. And all of,
feel meaningful. The Fortnite map was pretty consistently updated every season between 1 through 10. Often large parts of the island were redesigned or changed to a new biome type, such as snow or desert. However, for Chapter 2, the development challenges were on another scale. We needed to create a completely new island while dealing with new tech challenges like a more diverse terrain with a gameplay interactive water system, all in a time frame not very different from recording a little bit more easily. We're going to start with landscape. We're going to talk about the new virtual texturing system used in Fortnite, the new landscape layer system, the new landscape splines allowing non-destructive editing, and custom blueprint brushes. Then we are going to talk about the new water system. This is a new system coming in Unreal Engine 426 that allows integrated terrain carving and fluid simulation, gameplay interaction, including waves and flow maps. Next up, we will talk about how Fortnite is using the new Sky Atmosphere component from Unreal Engine 424, as well as give a quick preview of the upcoming volumetric cloud system that will ship with Unreal Engine 426. And finally, we will end by talking about some general editing tools. That includes things like placing objects in the world such as trees, roads, and buildings, or breaking up the world for streaming, etc. Really the bread and butter of level design. Some of the tools we will show are available in the engine today, and others are still a work in progress, but we wanted to show some early examples. Our first feature category is... Now let's take a look at how Fortnite implements the runtime virtual texturing. The first thing required are runtime virtual texture volumes. These are volumes that tell the virtual texturing system how large each virtual texture needs to be in the world. Now in Battle Royale, since we have a lobby island so far away from the main island, we decided to give it its own separate virtual texturing setup, so as not to waste memory storing virtual texturing where we don't need it. And the second thing to note is that we actually have 2 volumes per virtual texture. One is the default virtual texture type, which includes base color, normal, roughness, and specular, and the other is world height, which includes the world height of anything inside the virtual texture. Here we see the main volume for the main island, and then the second volume for the main island, which includes the terrain and virtual texture height. These are the asset details for each of the runtime virtual texture assets. Notice the one on the left is set to base color, normal, roughness, and specular. This is like having a simplified material attributes set all in one asset. The one on the right is set to world height, which gives access to the height of anything in the runtime virtual texture to any material in the world that reads the RVT. This shows the implementation of virtual texturing inside of a terrain material. On the left, the material outputs to the virtual texture using the runtime virtual texture output node. This is what actually renders to the RVT. And then on the right, the virtual texture is sampled using the RVT sample target node. Downstream from this material attributes here, any custom blending effects can happen. Disturb the water and the foam on the surface of the water. The simulation is performed in a local range around the player, and it can be affected by a set number of other nearby players as well. The simulation can also be affected by the river flow maps that are generated by editing the water spline points. This causes the ripples to flow downstream, as you would expect. Here, a debug command is entered to show the character fluid force. We basically draw a stick figure shape by supplying bone locations and rendering them as capsules in a material. Boats use a simpler fluid force type that is a simple texture-based shape defined by an effects artist that is attached to the boat mesh. With the boat, we can cause much larger ripples and clear larger paths in the foam. The fluid simulation helps add to the feel of the player interacting with the world as they drive the vehicle. Here we take a look at how the foam erasing effect is done. Our fluid sim actually has two channels, a red channel and a green channel. The red channel is a standard fluid solver. You can actually find a similar example in the Content Examples project by loading the Blueprint Render to Target map. For the green channel, we perform a diffusion or a blur step that has a minor feedback from the red channel applied. This green channel is then used to subtract from the opacity of foam in the water. The swamp biome also makes interesting use of the fluid diffusion channel by making moving objects clear a path in the pond scum. This can provide some visual interest when wading through the swamp as a player, or driving through in the boat. It also uses the same method to create a glow effect in the slurp juice that is spilled throughout the swamp. Together. Controlling each time separately allows artistic control as a layer on top of physical basis. Here we see the effect of scrubbing the time of day preview inside of the editor. We can see how, even though this is a physically based sky, it still manages to look fairly stylized with nice artistic and stylistic colors. And here we disabled height fog, and now disabling the atmosphere. So you can see we still use an exponential height fog, and together the height fog with the sky atmosphere really forms the total atmosphere that we now have in Fortnite. Of what it's like to paint down actor foliage in the Fortnite map. Like before, we go to the Foliage Paint tab, and we see our selection of foliage that we've added to be able to paint with. When we select one, we can see that it's now able to specify an actor class. So we can just click down and paint these. And another new mode that's being shown here, which is really useful, is the new single instance mode, which means you can place a single instance with a click without having to worry about getting the density just right to where either you wouldn't get trees or you would get trees. Because the traditional foliage paint was more meant for, I think, painting down more density than single objects, but it's still pretty useful to be able to plop down trees and objects with single clicks around the level like that. This was definitely requested by the level designers and allowed them to use the foliage paint tool, whereas previously they
have high-end PC and console games ported to PC for the first time, and it's amazing. Engine in really exciting ways. Game developers have infinite creative flexibility. Like, if we can't render a realistic carbon fiber material, we'll just use paint or wood or something else. But when Ferrari needs carbon fiber in their car visualization, and our engine's become much better for photorealistic graphics for games as well as a result.
It seems like lighting has been a focus of our development, how Unreal has really been a drive. We're going to wait until a full version release of Unreal Engine before we implement these things? Or are you still, because it really seems like...
Another thing that we use in the engine is what we call a fast path for animation. The idea here is this is one of the animation graphs where the red nodes here are playing individual animations, and then into each animation we're doing some kind of logic to determine like a play rate. This could be some parameter graph turns into this, with lots of lightning bolts everywhere, which is what we like to see. And it means we're evaluating the whole graph, hitting that fast path, which again helps the editor, and would make you now select some assets, right-click, and run that blueprint on those assets at editor time. Here's comparing those two ideas. The top one is the higher quality but more expensive full prediction. So here we're taking from the server what the inputs were and we're replaying that movement so it's doing exactly what would happen. So for example, if there was a step, you'd actually see the player move up over it. And this is the highest quality. On the bottom, you can kind of see that capsule is sort of teleporting around. That's as it gets an update from the server each time, and we're just interpolating the skeletal mesh between those positions. So it doesn't look terrible, but it's not as snappy as doing the full client prediction. So again, this is driven by significance, and on mobile, we can use the lower one for a lot more of the players.
profiles in UE4. So device profiles allow you to specify different.
I think the lighting is awesome, though, man. It's I think the one thing about a game is always you'll see the shadow, the lighting, and that always just it's super immersive. And I think that really you guys insane amount of talent.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance there in games of like you want to express gameplay and have clarity, and then you also want to like convey emotion and like sense of scale and all that.
And you're
stuff.
doing this with music, and you're doing this with visuals, and
Oh,
you're doing
yeah,
this gameplay, and so it's definitely like an orchestral kind of thing that has to be done.
It's many dependencies. It's like one thing we probably should as well mention is buffer overview.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's useful, when you sort of start digging into the lighting. It's like you'll look through your different buffers and sort of make sure your materials are set up in a sort of neutral, even way. They don't have too much lighting baked in, so that when you do get to lighting,
It'll be a little more dynamic with them.
it'll be and it'll feel more natural.
Yeah.
So to give a quick overview of Fortnite's setup, it is fully dynamic, so no lighting is baked. The only thing that we bake is we store distance fields per meshes. That's just stored on a per mesh basis. That allows us to use ray trace distance field shadows on the directional light and distance field ambient occlusion. We have a very gameplay specific system set up for Fortnite. So, and it's a system that people could build on their own depending upon the needs of their game using blueprints or C++. In Fortnite, it's a mix of this C++ core system that's exposed through blueprints. And here in the world properties in a Fortnite map, we can sort of like tweak time of day to see how things are looking. And so the high-level explanation of how that's set up in Fortnite is we have this actor that references 4 times a day. There's nighttime, morning, noon, and afternoon. And for each one of those times of days, we have a ton of variables that blend between those different times of day. So we have 4 different post-process volumes.
Oh, wow.
We have
Sky.
we have 4. Yeah, it's like time of day changes. We change between a few different cloud locations, and we sort of like blend the light angle on them as well. And some of the fog, I think, is even built into the skybox so that it blends nicely with
And
the exponential high fog.
it's the same material on Sky, just different versions, different instances.
Yep.
So then it's really simple for your blueprint just to blend between some scalar parameter, and it's really natural then how it looks. It will not blend one cloud to another one. It just will make transition between different parameters.
Gotcha.
Just to give people an idea of the number of variables, this is actually a pretty daunting system to.
It's really powerful.
It's very powerful, but it's a bit daunting to get in there and start tweaking the lighting because you basically have these components over here. You have a post-process component, you can see for morning, day, evening, night, and you sort of like have every single setting you want to change for all of them. So you can like change your color grading, you change your depth of field, everything for all of these settings. And then on the class itself, we sort of dig into what's the skybox, fog, distance, diffuse, emissive. And so we're basically changing all of these values for every time of day. And, we'll basically, one thing that's like a good tool to use as a lighting artist, especially as you're tweaking, because even when it's static, not just when everything's fully dynamic, but there's tons of variables to change. So what we'll do is we'll set up camera shortcuts in the map. So like here, you set those up just by hitting like Control 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you can recall them. And what we'll do is take screenshots from all of those locations. You sort of start digging in and changing all of your variables and tweaking something. Then you take more screenshots and you sort of like compare, like, okay, that's where I was, that's where I am now. I like that I did this. I still feel like I need more of this.
Very
other
iterative.
thing. Yeah, and so, it helps us sort of keep track of not only how does it look over time as we're changing it, but because we set up multiple shortcuts in different locations, it helps us evaluate those changes across the map, because the maps can be very big.
Now, are you documenting what those changes are between iterations? So
Not usually.
if you need to go back, like you're like, well, that was just too much. I need to go back, and outside of restoring or
No, it's more of one of those things.
It's just like you keep in your head and you just go
Yeah.
and go and
okay.
it's coming with time.
The grid. We still subdivide them based on whether they don't move, they're static, they never move, and so we never have to update their position basically, frame to frame. If they're always moving or usually moving, like pawns and bullets and vehicles and that sort of stuff, and those actors we are continuously, once per frame per actor, we're figuring out if it's changed cells, and even that alone is a huge win. Here's what I suggest.
So if you're showing them, it'll need to.
Oh yes, right. Okay, here's Fortnite. Hey, Fortnite's running in Pi. The way I debugged a lot of this and did this stuff was like, there's some command. So wait, first off, gosh, sorry. Really quick. So right now there's not much in the graph. It's just basically a player and then all the. If I do net.repgraph.print graph, it's going to log to the. You have to run this on the server, but this is Pi. Like the server is in the same instance, so it got the command. But you do a print graph, and it's going to basically just print out all your nodes. So here's the grid spatialization 2D node, and you can see that most of the cells, all the cells, only have the player pawn in them. The player pawn Athena is the name of the class in Fortnite. And there ends up being like 30 of them, 35 of them in this test map. But then you also get your. This is the always relevant for actor list. This is the always relevant list. So you have like the client announce manager, the special actor replication info, the POI manager, the global event ability actor, blah blah blah. We have a special node for player state frequency, for player states themselves, and we kind of round robin them where we replicate one player state per frame. I can't get into why we do that, but it kind of helped us because our player states are kind of big. And yeah, so the main thing I wanted to show is that you can use this to figure out what your graph looks like, and then you can also use, if you do, what I'll do here is, let me build some stuff. Oh no, there it is. Okay, so I'm gonna build a couple walls, and then I'm gonna do, if I do net.repgraph. I do print all. I think with default parameters, it'll print one frame, but you can tell it to print like 5 frames or 10 frames or 100 frames if you want to see like stuff transition and then you like looking through logs. So now you can see like in the grid cells you have within the dormancy. Within the dormant. Oh, I didn't even talk about why that. Okay, we can't get to that. Sorry. The main point is that you see the PBWAs, which are player-built walls. You see them pop up in the rep graph, and then at the bottom here, what you do is you see what was pulled from the rep graph for that connection. So that's like this part right here, and it says these were the guys up here that got culled out because they weren't ready to replicate yet. Not ready means they haven't, like the replication period frame hadn't been. We've replicated recently, and it's not time to replicate them yet. So they got culled. And then these are all the actors that we prioritized, and 8 of them passed, and this is how we prioritized them, and this is why we prioritized them, and then that's pretty much it. Anything that came in here, you can be assured that replicate actor got called on, and actually that might not be the case. If you saturate the connection, they might actually get starved out. So let's not worry about that. The main point is
They tried to replicate.
They tried to replicate. So yeah. So the main point is like I don't know. So what I really did to
I have this tiny little snippet of Fortnite, kind of a little scaled down section of the game, and I'll go under the project settings. And we're going to turn on mesh distance fields, or at least I'm going to show you where to do it. They're technically already on in this project. But if we just search for mesh distance fields at the top, it's just a checkbox. If you turn this on, Unreal's going to say, hey, restart your project. And after you do that, it's going to calculate all of the mesh distance field for all of the objects that are loaded in your scene. So that'll take just a moment. We're not going to do that now because technically it's already been done. But let's see the result. So we can visualize distance fields by going under the Show menu, running down to Visualize, and just checking Mesh Distance Fields. And here's what they look like. So you can kind of see that force fieldy kind of nature of them. They sort of hover around a mesh, and they give you a pretty clean representation of a mesh. So like if we check out this car, you can tell that that's a car, but it's not perfect. As we kind of toggle back and forth, you can see how the mesh distance field represents the shape, but it's not perfect. And that's important for you to know because there's some ramifications for that in terms of lighting and memory usage. Now, understanding that, I want to talk about some of the features where we use mesh distance field, and the first of which is soft shadowing. So here inside the church, I've got this pipe organ that is already set up to use soft shadows, and as I drag this light back and forth, you can see that result. So instead of getting really sharp, really harsh dynamic shadows, particularly like look under the bench, we have these nice softened shadows with fuzzy penumbras. So let's see how we set that up. If I slide back a little bit, we have this lonely chair and a lonely spotlight illuminating it, and currently our chair is using standard dynamic shadows. Now if I go to the spotlight, I can turn on our first lighting feature, which is ray traced distance field shadows, which is a little bit of a mouthful, in case anybody wants to read that. So we'll turn that on. And notice our shadows don't look quite as good all of a sudden. They do get soft, but we lose a whole lot of detail. And why is that? Well, if we turn distance fields back on, which I've got attached to a hotkey just to make this demo a little easier, you can start to see why. That distance field has a pretty good representation of the seat of the chair, but the back of the chair is almost not there. You can kind of see a fuzzy area where it should be, but that's it. Then if you look at the shadow again, you start to see why that's important. So how do you change the quality of these distance fields? Well, you do that in the static mesh editor. So I'll just double click this mesh, open it up here in the static mesh editor, and if we scroll down in the LOD 0 section, we have a distance field resolution scale property. This is literally taking the resolution of that 3D texture and just kicking up its scale to give it more data to work with. Now I want to show you the result of changing this because it's a couple of different things you need to pay attention to. On the one hand, I mentioned earlier that we store mesh distance. If we take a look in the viewport, and I know it's virtually impossible to read from out there, but up in the upper left corner in my static mesh editor, you can see that we're eating up 0.00 megs of data. I'm sure there's a number down there somewhere, but it's so low that we don't even really feel it. However, I can change the scale value. Let's set it up to something really ridiculous like 5, and we'll apply those changes. And now take a look at my distance field over in the scene. It's now a much cleaner representation of the chair, but if we glance back over at our memory usage, we're now using 0.21 megs just for this one distance field. So this would add up very quickly. It's not something you want to crank up really high on every single mesh in your scene. So now that we know kind of the technical ramifications of this, let's take a look at the artistic ramifications. Now, if we look at our shadow, it's got a lot more detail. I would actually argue that if you wanted soft shadowing, this is probably too much detail. We're starting to get like a little crunchiness up here at the top. So let's scale that back down. We'll pull this back down to 1 where we were so we can kind of see the difference. And maybe try kicking it up to 2. There you go. We're starting to get kind of a nice softening effect there. So the idea is that you as the artist have a lot of power. Now, before we get away from distance field shadows as a feature, I want to talk briefly about lighting and levels. So distance field shadows are about 30 to 50% cheaper than standard cascaded shadow maps that we use for outdoor dynamic shadowing. The reason that's important is that if we could, we'd probably use use distance field shadows for all of our dynamic lighting outside, but they have a problem. They're completely static. They're pre-calculated earlier on in the editor, so if you have a static mesh like a tree and its leaves are blowing, that won't update distance field ambient occlusion. And to show that off, let me fly over here to this little firehouse. Now, And you would just place a skylight into your scene and set that skylight to movable. So it's got to be a fully dynamic skylight. I'm not actually going to do that because there's already one in my scene. And to show you its settings, I get to give you a tiny little window into the development of Fortnite. All of the levels in Fortnite need to be lit precisely the same way. So as a way to save time, we take all of the important lights in a Fortnite level and we add them into the world object. So if I just go to world settings and I search for the skylight, I can scroll down a little bit and here's all of the settings for my skylight. I don't have to dig for an individual actor. Now, the most important setting that affects ambience occlusion is called max distance. So it's occlusion max distance. This is how far the algorithm reaches to decide if two objects should be shadowing one another. Now, to show you this kind of changing, let's take a look at just the ambience occlusion and nothing else. So I'll go down to show, we'll go to visualize, and we'll take a look at distance field ambience occlusion. And you can see just the result and nothing else. Now, as I increase the occlusion max distance up to, say, 1,000, you see the AO gets a whole lot darker. I'll start calling it AO. That's short for ambience occlusion. Don't let me confuse you too much. Now, 1,000 is nice. Our AO gets a lot darker. However, it's a lot more expensive. That algorithm is now having to calculate a lot more potential objects that are affecting one another. So you have to be very careful as you change this. If as an artist, what you really want is for your AO to just get darker, you have options. So let's set this, actually just to show it off, let's set it down to 100. And you can see our AO almost goes entirely away. It's because we're only looking 100 units away, and if things are farther beyond that, they can't occlude anymore. So we'll put it back at its default of 600, and let's get out of this visualization mode. There we go. And if all we want to do is darken the occlusion, we've got a couple of settings here for occlusion contrast and occlusion exponent. These take the end result we've already calculated and just make it a little darker or lighter. So we'll set contrast up to 1, and we'll take occlusion exponent, set it to like 1.2, and you'll notice the inside of the fire hall gets a whole lot darker. Now, these settings are going to be consistent throughout any objects in your scene that are occluded with distance fields. So if I come over to this apartment complex, it's now very dark and murky in here. If we go back to our default settings of 0 and 0.8 respectively, it's now brighter again. So as an artist, you have a lot of control over how this ambience occlusion gets applied in your scenes. Now, just a quick word on how we're doing this kind of under the hood. We don't actually use every single individual distance field that was calculated in order to do this. We composite them all together into a simplified distance field that we call the global distance field. And we can take a look at this too. So we can go under show, back down to visualize, and turn on the global distance field. So this is kind of a composited version of all those distance fields we saw earlier. We are constantly generating this as you move through the scene. New distance fields that are brought into view are added to the global distance field. Ones that you don't see anymore are rolled off. It's important to note, though, if you're playing a game where you teleport the player to a new area, you may sometimes notice a slight hitch as the global distance field has to get completely rebuilt from ground zero. Just know that that's a thing. So we use this because it's more simplified to do things like distance field ambience occlusion. It just makes the calculation faster, and for softer effects like AO, it works really well. Okay, so let's jump to a couple of caveats about distance fields in general. First off, they're for DirectX 11 up and only, so they're not going to be right for every platform out there. Also, as we've kind of already discussed, they ignore deformation. So trees that are moving or any other meshes that have vertex animation, that animation will not show up. Know that going in. Also, distance fields work best if you only scale uniformly. You actually have a little back over to our little firehouse and just start clicking on parts of it, you'll notice it's not one great big monolithic mesh. It's actually made up of a lot of modular parts. Now that works really well for Fortnite, where you're breaking down walls and things, but it also works really well for distance fields in general. As I turn them on, the distance fields have a lot of individual detail because of this. If this was one great big monolithic mesh for the fire station, you'd end up with just one great big fat distance field. It would be very hard to get the detail that you need. And then finally, adjust that resolution scale that we showed earlier with care, because if you go crazy with that, you can eat up a lot of your system memory. So don't go nuts with it. Okay, now, when I mention things like watch out for how much memory you're using, I feel like I'm then obligated to tell you how you can send outputs and things. Let's have a look here. I'm going to clear out my log. Now, this command, I've got it written up here. It's really long. You'll never remember it. It's r.ao list mesh distance field. It's so long, I've already forgotten it. But there's a trick if you want to remember it. If you hit tilde to open up the console, you can type r.aol. Does anybody remember AOL? I'm going to get that joke out as many times as I can because sooner or later people will be like, seen? And this is already pre-sorted by how much memory they're using. So highest memory usage goes at the top. It tells you the scale setting that they were set to, and it tells you the name and path directly to the asset. So if you're running into memory promptly, but I don't think we actually talked about, let's go back over to our project settings, and let's search for mesh distance fields again. Now we have 2 checkboxes here for optimizations. We have 8-bit mesh distance fields. By default, these things are stored as 16-bit floating point texture value, so you can set this to 8-bit instead and use less memory, but it's a quality trade-off. They don't look as good at 8-bit as they do at 16, but we are using 8-bit in this case. Next, you can also compress your mesh distance fields. They're texture data, so it's very easy to compress that. The catch, though, is that if you're streaming data in and out, like level streaming, you may notice. Okay, so up to this point, we've done a lot of talking about static objects, distance fields, things which don't move, but what about characters? So for characters in Fortnite, and I got this little husk character here to talk about this, we use capsule shadows to help calculate our shadows. And to show you kind of what those are, we got this husk guy who right now is using standard dynamic shadows. You can see that his shadow is highly detailed. You can see his fingers and parts of his little baseball helmet down there reflected very well in his shadow. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on capsule-based shadows. We'll just do it for the direct shadow because he's in direct sunlight. And you'll notice his shadow gets a whole lot simpler. It's actually also got a little bit of softening to it, so it's a nice soft shadow. So how do we do that? So this is set up by way of capsule shadows. If I open up this guy in Persona, I can scroll down, and we have a couple of important properties here. We have the physics asset, which you might have heard of. This is how we set up ragdolls in Unreal. You take a whole bunch of physical objects, constrain them together, and you make a ragdoll. It's all well and good. But we have a second physics asset specifically for shadows. It's the shadow physics asset. The way we use this is that we use capsules to make a rough representation of the shape of the character, and then we cast shadows from that collection of capsules and not from the character's geometry itself. This is a whole lot cheaper, and it gives us the ability to cheat and do things like soft shadowing. Now, it does have a couple of caveats. The first one is kind of obvious. If we close this back and go back to our character, obviously there's a loss of quality here. Your shadows won't be quite as sharp, but that can be a boon as well. So if I fly back over to the church, let's come over here to this little unlit vestibule, and I'm going to bring a point light into the scene. And I'm going to give this point light a completely random, really good-looking color. Now, dynamic lights in your scene are easily the most expensive, and in some scenes in Fortnite, we have upwards of like nearly 100 dynamic lights on the scene at once, which would murder our GPU. We can't do that. So what we do instead is we have a setting on lights called max draw distance. I'm going to set this to 1,000. And now, as I back away from this light, watch what happens when we hit 1,000 units. The light just clicks off. Now that's nice. It's being completely cold. It's no longer hitting our GPU, but it's very abrupt, very obvious. It's going to freak your players out. They're going to just turn around and go like, oh my goodness, is there loot? Should I shoot something? So what we do instead is we fade those lights out over distance. We have a max distance fade range directly underneath this. If we set this to 500, now as I scroll back, the light gently fades away until it's gone. We use this on pretty much every single dynamic light in Fortnite. So as you get far away from them, they fade away and then they're gone. And it's not jarring to the player, and we get a lot of performance back from that. So make sure if you're building dynamic situation or dynamic lighting scenarios inside of Unreal, try to put this on all of your dynamic lights because it's not on by default. Now, the next feature I want to talk about is actually really tricky for me to demonstrate in the editor because it's free and it takes place entirely under the hood. So I get to talk with my hands for a minute. If you have a dynamic light that is not moving, say like on a light, talk a little bit about fog, or I guess more specifically, I don't want to talk about fog at all. The reason for that is there's actually a session here at you.